Good morning. My name is Ralph Ganis, Major Ralph Ganis. I'm retired U.S. Air Force intelligence officer, and I'm here for a few minutes to talk about a book I recently wrote called The Skorzeny Papers, Evidence for the Plot to Kill JFK. We're here today at the Lancer Conference in Dallas, Texas, in 2018, and I will be a speaker tomorrow morning, Sunday, to speak about the papers. I'd like to state that the Skorzeny Papers is a collection of papers that belong to a man named Otto Skorzeny, who was Hitler's top commando in World War II. My interest in these papers came from a long history of liking or understanding the study of history. And my intent was to write a book about Otto Skorzeny from a military history perspective. I am not a JFK historian. My interest was solely to write a book about Otto Skorzeny. His personal papers came up for sale about 6 years ago at an auction in the United States, but the papers came out of Spain, and I won the auction. So I got the papers, and they came directly, more or less directly from the family, from the wife, Elsa Skorzeny. And so I received these papers and was going to start a book about him. Now, Otto Skorzeny was Hitler's top commando. He did a number of incredible operations during World War II, and as a military man myself, I was very interested in him as a character, and also, what happened to him, because a lot of books have been written about his war life, what he did during the war, and his operations. But literally no one has ever known what he did after the war. So therein lies my interest to the papers. I felt that maybe these papers might reveal some of the things about his post-war life, particularly since he had been declared not guilty by the Nuremberg trials, and then he mysteriously escaped from an internment camp in 1948, and then 2 years later he surfaced in Madrid, Spain, and he was there throughout the Cold War, throughout the 50s. He died in 1975, and during that entire period he was a great enigma, and to this day historians were like, well, what was this guy doing here? He was Hitler's top commando. He goes to Spain. I mean, was he running some underground neo-Nazi outfit, the Odessa or something like that? So I really didn't know. I wanted to find out. I thought maybe the papers might answer that question. Well, the papers came to me after I won the auction, and I very quickly, given my background in intelligence, I was very quickly able to determine that he was an asset of the United States government and other governments for doing covert operations against the Soviets. And so he was working for the West. Bottom line, he was working for the West after the war. He was one of many former Nazi officers that were brought in. People are very familiar with the engineers that were brought in for Operation Paperclip to work the rocket program. And in this case, Skorzeny was brought in for his operational capabilities and intelligence capabilities. That was also of great interest to us. We did not want the Soviets to capture and utilize Nazi assets, and Skorzeny was one of them. So in any event, the book, The Skorzeny Papers, Evidence for the Plot to Kill JFK, is the analysis of those papers, of Skorzeny's papers, and the revelations of the people and organizational structures and the networks that they reveal. Now, the additional piece to this, and it's the reason that I'm here, is unbeknownst to me, I had no idea that this would happen. I mean, I very quickly determined he was an asset of Western intelligence, but also that the businesses that were in the papers were actually the cover businesses for his operational capability, and that those businesses extended into Dallas early on in the early 40s, or late 40s rather, into the 50s and up into the 1960s. So the fact of the matter is there was an operational cover, if you will, that was being utilized by the United States government that was in place in Dallas years before the Kennedy assassination. That capability, that network, was being coordinated by Otto Skorzeny. So there is the big surprise. Now, the papers are going to revolutionize all studies of the JFK assassination, because this is not an idea I came up with. I have no vested interest in JFK myself personally. I'm not a JFK historian. I did not develop a hypothesis. I merely researched the papers. This was the conclusion. Those papers will be made public at some point, hopefully in the near future, so that every American will have access to them and can study them like they do other papers that are in archives at the National Archives or Duke University, perhaps the University of North Carolina. Wherever they reside, the public can see them and look at them, and they will, can make their own determination. But I feel very confident they come to the same conclusions that I did, that the scholars will look at these and say, yes, in fact, Skorzeny was a covert asset of the CIA and the United States government, as well as other governments, helping us during the Cold War. That covert network that was covered by businesses that were in the papers contained assassination assets and assassination capabilities. And it was that assassination capability that developed by the end of the 1950s into the early 60s and as an executive action capability. In other words, a capability the United States government could use to direct against foreign leaders. That capability was at the head of it was Otto Skorzeny. And that was the capability that was turned against the President of the United States on November 22nd, 1963. Now, the papers do not reveal motive. However, I was able to do some comparative analysis between what is known and the facts that were derived from the papers to a timeline analysis of events that occurred, in the run-up to the assassination. So I do have a chapter on motive, and I state that there are two events that are critical to understanding why Kennedy was assassinated. I don't have time in this venue to go through with them in detail, but I can direct the listener to these two events. One was the Profumo affair, which was a prostitution ring. It was a major scandal in England, where their equivalent of our Secretary of Defense was caught in a prostitution scenario, and it nearly brought down the British government. The prostitute in question was Christine Keeler. Christine Keeler. This is well known to history. You can study this. And she was also the girlfriend of the Soviet attaché in London. So the British government was about to be brought to its knees because of this scandal. This was in 61, 62 time frame, and Kennedy was watching this very carefully, President Kennedy, because he himself was utilizing the services of another prostitution ring that was running simultaneously in Washington, D.C. That prostitution ring was being run by a man named Bobby Baker, a political operative of LBJ, the vice president. Bobby Baker was being investigated for a slot machine scandal. It's called the Bobby Baker scandal. Again, the listener can look it up. But he was also running a high-dollar call girl service in Washington, D.C. for government officials, lobbyists, senators, House of Representatives, and the President of the United States. So it was a big mess. That prostitution ring overlapped in the Profumo ring. The prostitution ring in the United States, being run by Bobby Baker, had at its center a female operative named Ellen Romisch. She was an East German or West German wife of a West German soldier airman who was here in the United States TDY. On the side, she was performing services for this prostitution ring. A very beautiful, high-dollar call girl. In any event, the president was with her. The problem here is she was also a Soviet agent. So the Soviets had penetrated through a honey trap this prostitution ring as well as the Profumo affair. All this was getting ready to be known. There was a crisis in the halls of government in Washington, D.C. There was no way to stop the release of the information. The president was going to be totally disgraced. The office of the presidency would have been destroyed. With the other participants, congressmen, senators, lobbyists, the entire halls of government were potentially in a catastrophic nosedive. Not to mention that the Soviets had penetrated it, which brings into question compromises to command and control, nuclear command and control for the president and the other halls of government, other departments of government. The Soviets would have declared a high-ground moral victory at the height of the Cold War. So the National Command Authority, Johnson, Secretary McNamara, Defense, Dean Russ, State, Joint Chiefs of Staff, Lemnitzer, and Curtis LeMay, others, made a grave decision, one they probably obviously did not want to make. I equate it to dropping the atomic bomb in the book. They had to do it to save the country. They sacrificed one man to save the country. the heartbreak and the agony of knowing about the prostitution rings, the penetration of the Soviets, and all of the disgrace that would have followed in that revelation. So they made a martyr out of one man and iced the revelation in its tracks. And then safeguards were put into place to keep the conspiracy intact. So that was the motive. That's what I'm saying the motive was. Now again, the Skorzeny papers do not reveal motive. I derived the motive through parallel analysis. But what the Skorzeny papers do reveal conclusively is that all the operational aspects of the assassination, and I break them down into the action group, those that carried it out, the support group that provided the cover for the participants, and the deception group that was manipulating Oswald to put him in place as the patsy. The operational template, they could have used anybody. They put Lee Harvey Oswald in there. He may have been followed or being used for some other purpose, and he was just the perfect candidate. Anyway, they positioned him in place, and Oswald is linked to the Skorzeny papers. Ruby is linked to the Skorzeny papers, and the shooter, Jean-René Suetry, who was by declassified documents as a French air commando who had left the French military, was on the OAS assassin teams attempting to kill de Gaulle earlier in before 1962. He was an OAS operative, high level, an assassin. He was flown out of Dallas the day after the assassination. That's confirmed by declassified documents. He is also linked to the Skorzeny network because after he left the OAS, they were disbanded due to French intelligence pursuit. Suetry joined Skorzeny, and it was Suetry who was sent in with the assassination team. I don't know how many, don't know. I don't go into forensics, but it was Suetry who commanded the team. Oswald was the deception. All of the pieces are put in place. All the principal players, including George DiMaurencio, Paul Rogeratsky, and others in Dallas, are linked to the papers. This is conclusive. The Skorzeny papers are the conclusive evidence that the United States government killed Kennedy. They killed him at the request of the National Command Authority. In fact, my book is the first book to ever mention the words command and control. This was a U.S.-directed, high-level operation. No conspiracy to get the mafia. No money was passed. Orders were issued. Orders were carried out. It's that simple. Very few people knew about Skorzeny's relationship with the United States government. Even fewer knew that he was an assassination capability. So the number of people in the government that knew maybe was 5, maybe less, maybe 1, 2, 3, or 4 guys. Probably 5. But the bottom line is, highly compartmentalized operation. It would not be fair or accurate to say the CIA killed Kennedy. That is not true. However, an assassination capability resident within one office, one compartmented office of the agency, that would be Staff D of the agency, did have a capability that was at the discretion of the National Command Authority for the elimination of foreign leaders. That capability was run by Otto Skorzeny. That's what the papers reveal. I could go on for hours about the details. However, we'd like to encourage the readers to get this book. It is a complex book because the operation was simple in its conception, but highly complex when you look at the organizational structures, and you need to also understand the histories of that take place from Skorzeny's release in '48 all the way to his use as a high-level assassination coordinator in 1960s. He continued to help the United States all the way to his death until 1975. He was also used by the Israelis. They have admitted that. I have interviewed extensively the Israeli Mossad officer who recruited Skorzeny, who happened to be the same Mossad officer who targeted and captured Eichmann. I interviewed men who knew Skorzeny, CIA officers included. So this is not only backed up by the Skorzeny papers, but the extensive interviews I did. There's no personal opinion on this. I did not put my own opinion up in this book. It is either the results of the interviews, the analysis of the Skorzeny papers, and the comparative analysis against the declassified documents. I will read directly from the front of my book. and this is what a statement that I stand by. Again, my name is Major Ralph Ganis, United States Air Force retired U.S. intelligence officer, and here's the opening of my book, and I firmly stand behind this with a matter of conviction. The Warren Commission was not created to find the answer to the JFK murder, but was an attempt to deflect away from all intelligence and operational links to the assassination. Witnesses that should have been called were not. Others acted as agents of deception. Superfluous and irrelevant data abounds in the documents obtained by equally worthless witnesses and individuals called to testify. Mountains of documents were created to confuse, mislead, and divert attention away from the true conspiracy that was linked to a covert paramilitary network operating in Dallas and linked directly to Otto Skorzeny. There's a lot of information in this book, and like I said, scholars can look it over and come to their own conclusions, but I believe once the papers are in their hands and they're able to look at the analysis and combined with actual documents, that the answer will be conclusive. Again, this was carried out to save the country. Now that's what I believe. They didn't want to do it. In my lifetime, I did know Paul Tibbets, the man who dropped the atomic bomb, and I had some conversations with him. So I would have to equate this decision on that order, a horrible order, one a soldier probably would not want to get, but had to be carried out for the better good of the people, the nation, and the West. So with that being said, I hope to make myself available to anybody that may have questions, but there's the answer. The American public wanted it, and I have brought it to you, and I hope you enjoy the book, and don't let those facts disturb you. Decisions sometimes have to be made that are not pretty, can be ugly, but at some point these things should be known, and I think now is a good time, and we should be proud of our country, despite the dark revelations of this book. I mean, it was a terrible situation. Perhaps it could have been handled differently, but this was the decision that was made, and there it is. So, with that being said, I'll end this little clip and look forward to seeing people in the future. Thank you.